You are now listening to the Project Kuwait. Where we stop at nothing to bring you the right facts on health, fitness, and psychology. Featuring some of the world's most experienced professionals. So you can learn, lift, and live. With your hosts, Meg, Dr. D, and Mehdi. A lot of athletes do the bench press with as much weight as possible. They have that really slow coming down, that really slow going up. My uncle, who's an old school bodybuilding coach, he saw me bench press and he was like, "Why are you throwing so much on there?" I was like, "Oh, I want to lift a lot of weight." And he was like, "That's just making you a lot slower, right?" Huh? And I never got it. And then he had me actually stop going all the way down. You want to be as fast and as quick out of the hole as possible, because that's what's going to translate to sports and create those fast twitch muscle fibers. It did actually make a big difference in my game.
Is that if at any point your client stops and asks you, "Why am I doing this?" and you can't give them a clear and concise answer that applies specifically to their goal, they should stop what they're doing, go to the counter, get their money back, and then you should follow them out, because you're just showing exercises. And showing exercises, like I just said, I can go on YouTube and get tons of exercise for free. You're not really coaching me. All you're doing is just showing exercises, and I can do that at home for nothing.
All this and more in today's episode. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the project. And back on the show, and let me see if I can get this right, Eric DeGatti, right?
You nailed it.
All right, there we go. I was reading it earlier, and I'm like, shit. And on the video I posted on Instagram, and I suck at editing because we use one of those like video to like Word. I don't even know. My wife does it all. And it misspelled your name wrong. And I couldn't figure out how to edit it. And it was like, all right, you know what? I can't do anything. It is what it is. So, and it was only in like the little subtitle things, like when you talk, it like throws it out there. It's all right. It screwed my name up too. So, it's all good. I hope you don't mind, man.
Hey, listen, we got to get that thing to learn how to speak Jersey.
Yeah, no. You know what? Jersey, you guys got a lot of good trainers out there. A lot of good trainers, a lot of big influencers. Mainly, isn't Jeff Cavalier out of Jersey, Athlete X?
Him, I don't know, but I'm right down the road from Joe DeFranco is a friend. And
Joe DeFranco is another one, yep.
We've shared some clients. Mike Guadango's not far from me. He's another great, really smart guy. And then, that's kind of just in my immediate area. But, we have a fair amount of talent in this area.
Yeah, you guys got Bon Jovi too, right? He's from Jersey.
Absolutely. Well, he's more South Jersey. He's down by the beach, where I'm up in Sopranos country up here in North Jersey, up by just outside of New York City.
Oh, that was the best show, man. That was one of the best shows. To be honest with you, one of my all-time favorite shows. You also have the younger listeners won't know this guy, Danny DeVito. Danny DeVito's from Jersey, right?
Yeah, a lot of people trace their roots back here. Yeah.
And I don't even know how I know that. But I know Danny DeVito's from Jersey. One of my best friends, he's originally from Jersey. So that you guys say wash and water, which I think is pretty funny. So
yeah, sometimes we need a translator.
Yeah. Well, all right. We'll dive into a little bit of sports. And before the show started, we were talking about post-lockdown. Mm-hmm. So how's it been for you guys and your sports community post-lockdown, and especially for the younger kids too? 10 to 18 and 18 plus, I'm sure they're back on the fields, but how's it been out there?
Well, mission number one, and I mostly work with high school and higher. Mission number one that we talked about was the fear was knowing coming out of this lockdown, the injury risk was going to be significant. And you saw it in the NFL. I mean, I think we've seen close to 30 ACL tears already in a matter of 9 weeks, and the injuries are rampant. We saw it in baseball with a ton of injuries when they started back up. And so that was mission number one. And then I knew that going into it. And my time at the NFL, right there, I was working with a couple teams during a lockout. And there was more Achilles injuries in the first 3 weeks than there usually is in a full season, the year when they came back after the NFL lockout. Now, that was a different scenario. During the lockout, they just were locked out from their facilities, but they could still go to their own massage therapists, acupuncturists, gym, strength coach, all that stuff. Well, now we had nothing. And so I think that's where you see a lot of the fall off with the injuries was. Now, I use it kind of as a challenge, especially for my high school teams, to say this was the great equalizer. No one has an advantage. No one has a fancier weight room. No one has access to anything other than what we're on now, which is Zoom. And so I had to figure out a way to get these kids prepared to play physical sports, because they could turn the switch on at any time, and they did. And I had to be ready for that, and with nothing but kids in their living room. Right. And how do I do that? With body weight, I said the teams that are going to survive are the teams who are most creative and who can get the greatest buy-in. And, fortunately, the teams I have, they bought in and, knock on wood, we're going into the end of the fall season and we had minimal, if any, non-contact injuries.
That makes a lot of sense. And for some of the novice listeners out there that, if you go into a situation and your body's not conditioned for it in the environment that it's supposed to be in, you're going to get hurt. If you sprint full speed and your deceleration's off or whatever, just because your body's not there, you might pull a hamstring. And I mean, can you talk about that? Because you guys going into lockdown in the United States, the weather was pretty good, if I'm not mistaken. It was, you guys, your lockdown kind of started around April, which is springtime in the Northeast region. You're getting 60-degree weather pretty much, if I'm not mistaken. And then it went into parts of July, I guess. So kids were able to get out, or athletes were able to get out and do sprints and, all the various drills. What about the ones that were stuck inside? And I'm relating this to some of the athletes here in Kuwait because the summer's so hot here. What were some of the drills that you could do to work on their speed and their running, their deceleration in a small confined space?
Yeah, and that was tricky. And even for us, as nice as it was, like all the local fields were locked down. You couldn't get on your local high school field. They wouldn't let you out there because their fear was kids congregating and working together. So the first key is working on exactly what you said, deceleration. That's where most of your injuries occur, whether it's a rolled ankle, whether it's even worse, a collapsed knee that leads to an ACL, even if it's deceleration in the arm for a throwing athlete. That's one of the big issues. And then even when you talk about hamstring pulls, hamstrings are decelerators and not having the ability to do that. So making sure that you're balancing out your workload in terms of making sure you're getting enough posterior chain work, making sure you're emphasizing the eccentric component of that. And then even simple things that we would do, like a multi-planar hop out, to kind of simplify that. It's basically bouncing on one foot, hopping forward to the other foot, being able to stick and land that, and learning the ability to use your foot in that arch as a parachute. I always say on the deceleration, it's like a parachute. That heel, pinky toe, big toe kind of absorbs that force, and then everything stacks on top of that. So if the foot doesn't do that, the foot collapses, well, then the knee's going to collapse in. And then on the top side of that, the other side, you have your glute and all your hip musculature. Well, they steer that upper leg and femur. If they don't activate and communicate with the foot, well, then that's where everything kind of collides and collapses. And that's where you see a lot of your non-contact stuff that you get into. So something as simple as hopping from one foot to the other. If kids had access to a jump rope, I always say that is when, especially with young kids, when parents will ask me, what can I do for them for speed? I say the first thing is get them to jump rope. It checks so many boxes. It gets them up onto the balls of their feet, or what I call the power pads of the feet, and gets them springing off of there. You're going to get some deceleration and some good elasticity through not only the Achilles and calf complex, but throughout the whole posterior chain if you're doing it right. Teaches them posture. If you don't hold yourself in a good posture, you're going to end up catching that rope and you don't learn to pull your toes up and you don't do all that stuff. So it does that. And then the most underrated thing I think it does is it creates rhythm. And I always say when we talk about speed I always joke, I'm going to write a book called Rhythm and Glutes. There's two things really fast people have. They have rhythm and they have glutes. And so establishing that rhythm, and it's not just sprinting, it's everything. If you look at an infielder field a ball, if you look at somebody like who's a really smooth ball handler in basketball, there's something rhythmic to it that differentiates them athletically from other people. And then having the ability to have the horsepower on top of that, that's where the glutes come in to be able to decelerate and reaccelerate and kind of turn that stuff around. So that's some of the first things that we start with.
I love that you say the jump rope because I think it's a forgotten art and it's something I'm a CrossFitter, so I am a little bit biased, but I think it was something CrossFit kind of brought back onto the scene with the whole double unders thing, back in 2010, 2011, 2012 with getting the jump rope back into the gym. It was seldom that you would see a kid jump roping, let alone anyone in a gym atmosphere jump roping. And I love that you broke it down so simply for people in the rhythm of a jump rope. I suck at double unders. I mean, I have no rhythm. You don't want to see me on a dance floor. It's pretty horrible. You know what I mean? But that's a good one. How about skaters? Do you like skaters? What's your opinion on skater hops as opposed to the forward hops?
I'll go front back. I'll go side to side. I'll go rotational, diagonal. You need to work on all the planes. That's the other thing that happens is when you get hamstring pulls is because everybody just does straight ahead running and then they don't work on the ability to change directions, work in multiple planes. And I think that's one of the most essential things, is not only on the field and sprint work, but also even in your strength training work, is that our lower body stuff, when I'm checking the boxes to make sure someone's program is complete, I want to make sure that they're doing something that forces them to not only work, but stabilize in all planes, because that is extremely important. Now, with the skater hops, specifically in that lateral frontal plane, first thing I'm going to have you do before you go and bound back and forth for either power and or conditioning effect, the first thing you got to show me is, can you stick it? Can you decelerate first? Can you jump from your left, stick on your right, and own it, right? And I always say that the time from when that foot hits the ground to the time when you own it, there's going to be a little bit of wobble. How much can I minimize that wobble? The time from when your foot makes contact to the time when you can stick and stay there, the more I can cut that time down, because we have, and how I break down speed on your feet is I have a system I call the power of three, right? So everything we do is in one of three foot positions. You're either on a single leg, sprinting is 85% single leg, or cutting a lot of the time is single leg. You're in a split or staggered stance, like a breakdown position, like when we decelerate and get into a break and a receiver running his route, or a change of direction on a soccer field. And then you have an open stance, which is just feet parallel, which is where we spend the least amount of time in most sports. So you have those 3 foot stances. So I'm going to check the box and say, am I covering all those? The next thing we have is you have 3 directions you move. You move front to back, you move side to side, and then you move diagonal/rotational. Am I checking all those boxes? Am I training in all those planes? And then the last thing is you have 3 phases of movement. You have acceleration, which is the last thing I train. You have deceleration, which is the first thing I train. And then you have amortization, the time from when you decelerate to when you can reaccelerate again. And that kind of goes to the contact time, to say from the time your foot hits to the time when you own it, how quick can I make that time? Because that's going to cut down your amortization time. And so it's the analogy I always give is tapping the brakes. So imagine I have a race car and I'm racing around a racetrack oval. The car that's going to win the race doesn't go full speed, gets to the bend, slams on its brakes, turns the wheel, speeds up again, slams on its brakes, turns the wheel. No, the one that just kind of taps the brakes and uses the brakes as little as possible and really hugs the turn, that's the one who's going to win the race. So being able to control and cut down that amortization is the key to making the most plays. And what I mean by that is that we could take a whole team and test all their 40s or 60s or 100-yard sprints. The one who makes the most plays is not always going to be the one who comes in first. It's the one who gives away the least speed, the one who can manage their brakes and be as efficient on the field as possible. Now, if you get somebody who's really fast forward and they're efficient, well, then you're buying their jersey in the store.
It makes a hell of a difference, because if you could go to the right on the drop of a dime and go to the left on the drop of the dime, all of a sudden now you're an elite athlete. And I think that's one thing a lot of coaches neglect a lot, is they're testing the 40 and they're not testing what else you can do. And I think it's so important. What are some of the drills that coaches can do besides, a 40-yard sprint or a 50-yard sprint, or, just the normal things that we see day to day to test athletes' ability in terms of speed? And I'm jumping forward a little bit here. I don't want to forget the question before that. I actually did have a plan, but I was like, all right, he brought it up, so I got to go with the punch here.
You got it. Absolutely. So in terms of drills for testing or drills for improving, because my question is always go back to what's the goal?
I mean, test and improve. As a baseball coach, a little backstory. I used to have my kids sprint around the bases. I would go home to first, take their time down, home to, second, take their time down, home to third, take their, then all the way around the horn. And I would also go first to second, second to third, just to see if there was any mental change or anything at all. Now, that gave me a small indication of how fast they were. But when a kid drops a bunt or hits a ground ball, everything changes. It's a different ball game. So I would have that general idea. But in a game situation, that's where I really could tell how fast they were. What are some indications that other coaches could use from your perspective?
It's going to be, and you brought up the point that you recognize, even within the same sport, it's going to be task specific, right? You can get a kid he can beat out a ground ball to second base, right? There's that fast, like from the box to home plate, there to first base. They're that fast. You get them in a rundown, they're done because they can't cut, change direction, be deceptive any way, shape, or form. So there's different qualities that we're really looking at. So there is no all-around one person who's just fast, because I don't know how good Usain Bolt would be at it as being a defensive back. So there's a matter of how much it's specific to whatever their activity is. Again, I would look at things that force you to not only go straight ahead, but also change direction. Something as simple as a 20-yard shuttle, a 5-10-5 shuttle, where they're going 5 yards in one direction, 10 yards back, and then back 5 yards, which they do in the NFL Combine. That's going to look at things. They do like an L cone drill. All those things kind of looking to create a complete profile are going to tell you a little bit. And then also understand that 40 is going to be more important for the special teams guy who has to get down the field, who's also a receiver maybe, than it is going to be for an NFL lineman. I always joke with my football lineman that if you're running 40 yards, either something really good happened or something really bad happened. You're generally not running 40 in a normal situation. So that's kind of some of those things. And then in terms of looking at their strength and power balance, one of the biggest things that I've incorporated in the last few years and got this from the work of people like Dr. Greg Rose at TPI and Tom House, and learning how to train the accelerators is one of the big accelerators in sprint. The decelerators in sprinting is the hamstring. All right. And it's something called the big break theory, that your body will only let you go as fast as you can control with your brakes. Okay. Now, some people have the explosiveness to override that, and they're the ones who have the yanked hamstrings. But reverse sprinting is something that I've incorporated with all my teams and all my field athletes to have a lot of success, and not only helping develop greater speed and greater mechanics, but also in terms of preventing hamstring injuries. And generally the rule of thumb that they'll say is whatever you run your 40 forwards in, you should at least run your 30 in reverse. And so being able to have that horsepower on the back end is very important for kind of getting those governors pulled back, because really everything we do is governed by our nervous system, and all we're trying to do is peel back those governors as much as possible to perform at the highest level. And being able to see that also tells me I have a little bit more robust athlete, well-rounded athlete that's going to be a little bit more bulletproof than only somebody who can move straight ahead.
It makes sense. And this is the first time I'm hearing of a reverse sprint. I mean, I've never honestly heard of it before. And I'm sure a lot of coaches are in the same boat as me. And I think, teaching how to catch a fly ball, we used to have a drill where it'd be like, all right, you run backwards. And then I scream, all right, go. And then you turn around, I throw the ball, pick it up, and, you got to sprint forward. So it's not the same, but it's kind of teaching that nervous system response rate. Now, here's my argument, and I'm not trying to argue this point because it's probably been tested and I haven't done it, but running in reverse, wouldn't someone say, hey, that's just crazy, dude? Like, why are you running in reverse? You're never going to do that on the field of sport. And wouldn't you want to train your hamstrings to go forwards? What would your argument to that be?
I got no problem being crazy, first of all.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Everybody that they said was crazy usually is right about 10 years later. So,
sure, yeah.
So yeah, I'm absolutely going to still train them to go forward. We'll get back to forward in a second. But where this kind of came from, so where people like Tom House starts thinking this way is it started like looking at the arm and say, well, why do we have so many elbow and shoulder issues with throwing athletes, and tennis athletes do the same motion as fast and as ballistically, but they don't have those issues? And what they started to think about, well, they don't let go of the implement. They hold on to it. And so there's a deceleration factor. So you don't just whip the racket across the court. So there's a decelerator effect in there. And so then you look at some of the fastest athletes in the NFL, they're the defensive backs almost. And so, you always tease a defensive back. He's just a receiver who can't catch, but they're generally the fastest, and they can turn on a dime and they control their hips really well. And they spend a lot of their time running backwards. And when I'm talking about running backwards, I'm not talking about a back pedal. I'm talking about running backwards. Like I always face my athlete and say, you're going to run backwards like I'm a bear chasing you, and the only way you can go is back. And they figure it out. Okay. Now, the dynamics of teaching how you use the hamstring in terms of going forward is one of the big things I think is important for athletes to understand. I mean, as a baseball guy, as soon as a guy hits a ground ball, first base coach yells, what word? Dig. Yeah. Right. They want to dig, right. And it's really a bad external cue. The cue that I give everybody when they're running is that just the simple mechanics of how it works. Your foot hits the ground, and what happens is your glutes, your hamstrings, your calf, that whole posterior chain kind of pulls your body over, pulls your leg underneath you, pulls your body over to set the foot for the next stride. So essentially what you're doing is you're putting your foot in the ground, grabbing the ground, and pulling the ground underneath you. So when I say you're running to first base, you're running to get a ball in soccer, you're running to that fly ball in the outfield, you're running to the end zone. don't run to the end zone. Pull the end zone to you. So as soon as you put your foot in the ground, I want you to think of pulling the ground underneath you forcefully. That's where you get them to learn to get the hamstring involved forward. So it's not that we're disregarding it forward, but we're teaching it from a different external cue. The more that we're learning about motor learning, and it's the real smart motor learning people have known this all along, is the internal cues of tighten this, squeeze this, fire this. Your body doesn't comprehend, and certainly not at the reflexive level it needs to happen when you're doing anything athletically. Giving that external cue of pull the ground underneath you, pull that finish line to you is a completely different dynamic. And that's what I find gets a lot of athletes to connect and understand and feel like, wow, I sprinted yesterday and my glutes and my hamstrings are torched. I've never felt that before.
Yeah, no, it makes a big difference. And just to throw it out there, I mean, when you hear the first base coach say dig, 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 I think it's just something in baseball. I don't think anyone knows what the hell they're saying. They're just, you grow up hearing it your whole life, and It's just common, a common saying in baseball, I guess. Or maybe, I have no idea, man. But I know, like, I never meant it by dig your feet into the ground. It was just like dig it out, like something like that. But I wanted to bring up another point you talked about. You brought it up casually, which was your hips. And I think people often forget about how important your hips are when it does come to speed and acceleration. Like if you have tight hip flexors, you could tell. I had a coach that, I was running. He was like, dude, your hip flexors are really tight. And then all of a sudden he started me, working with my mobility, and I got faster. And I couldn't figure it out. And it's because I had tight hip flexors. And he was like, you're not fully extending. You're not getting the range of motion that you need when you are running. So what are some of the things that a coach could look out for, in your opinion, to spot out some of those small cues like tight hip flexors, tight glutes, for instance? Obviously we don't want players to spend an hour on a foam roller, but what are some indications there?
Okay. So, the easiest way to tease it out is just do a simple movement screen, and it doesn't take a whole lot. That's 8 to 10 minutes. You can tease out and look at someone's squat, lunge, step, leg raise, that kind of thing. And that's where the FMS is so elegant in looking at those things to say, not because it has a built-in redundancy where I'm looking at your hip flexors 6 different ways and 6 different patterns, but also I'm also going to tease out a little bit of your profile to say, we make the assumption that it's tight when it's maybe tight for a reason. So first thing I'm going to look at is, do you have enough mobility? Well, if I look at your hip flexion and they look stiff when you're running, but then I put you on a treatment table or you're laying on the floor and your hip flexors aren't stiff anymore, well, that's not tightness. That's not a mobility issue. That's a motor control issue. You're stiffening as a protective mechanism to protect your pelvis and spine and everything else that goes with it. So that's a motor control issue. So you stretch that person, you're actually going to make them worse. You're going to leave them more susceptible to injury. So first you got to check your boxes, before you go and foam roll or stretch anybody. Do you even need mobility? And then it's a matter of, can you control it? And if you can't control it statically, well, you're not going to control it dynamically. If you can't do it slow, you won't be able to do it fast. And so making the assumption that someone looks stiff doesn't mean they are stiff. And then even there comes a point, and this is where you really get into looking at things, is that there's a difference between being restricted and being stiff. There's a certain requisite amount of stiffness that you want to have in your calf complex so you can spring off the ground. And you want to have in your hips to create that tension and spring. And some of the fastest athletes in the world that I've ever gotten to work with, they present as stiff. Now, if you can keep that stiffness and spring, but yet not have them prohibited by their movement and not have that lack of mobility create strain someplace else where it's going to now create low back or hamstring or hip or ankle issues. That's really the art of doing this, there should be a certain amount of stiffness. And so, like, if you look at the loosest people you could think of, right? And you go find, go into town and find the yoga instructor. Yeah. He or she is the loosest, goosiest person in town, and he or she also produces the least force in town.
100%.
Right?
That is 100% true.
I'm like as slow gets, right? I could race a pregnant lady and come in third, right? I'll beat my yoga instructor in his foot race because there's just no because all they've worked on is just long, slow, hypermobile type movements. And so there's a time and place for that. But if you steal away that stiffness from a power athlete, you're going to take gas off of their performance.
I love that you bring it up because power output, sometimes you really need to be tight. And I use that for myself. If I overdo it with my stretching and warm up, I'd say warm up. I don't even really stretch. It's more of a dynamic warm up for me now. If I overdo it and I'm too loose going into it, and I did mobility the night before, and I've tested this, my squat goes down about 15 pounds just because I break at the bottom. I break at my weakest point, and I just can't hold that tightness like I did when I go into it with, my perfect storm of a warm up, if that makes any sense. And I've had coaches say, oh, you're too stiff, but sometimes it's good. And I mean, especially when it comes to power output, how could you translate that to a kicking athlete? Let's use soccer as an example, or a punter in football, for instance.
And you're not alone in that. A lot of people get lost because they've missed a step in the middle. And what I mean by that is if you look up the kind of chain of command and hierarchy of movement in the movement profile, you first have mobility. Can you even get there? Right? Then you kind of jump to step 3, which is producing force off of that strength. And then power is just strength with a lot of speed added to it. The missing step is control, is that motor control. Can you own that movement? And so mobility gets a huge amount of acclaim because you have a lot of stiff athletes and they all hurt and everybody's breaking down in the weight room. And, the research shows that fitness is creating injuries now, which is kind of, again, goes against the grain of what it should be doing. And so everybody then runs and hops on this mobility craze and they create a whole bunch of mobility and then they go see the performance go down. And then so they're kind of lost. Well, the gap in the middle is control, is being able to have that motor control, being able to control yourself on a single leg, on a narrow base of support, in a low hip position, in a rotated position, with arms overhead, with arms at your sides. All those things, being able to have control of those positions and shapes and postures, that's the missing link to kind of connect the two. And some of that is what's going to actually fire up your nervous system and kind of prep, or what I call a feeder in the weight room. It kind of gets your nervous system more amped up. So like an example would be having you just do a bottoms up kettlebell hold prior to doing your overhead press. That kind of feeds your brain to, like, if you don't hold that thing with the right wrist position, with the right shoulder position, with the right elbow position, you're going to dump. It's a self-limiting type of thing that teaches you right from wrong, and you have to do it right. Now, you take that type of feeding into the bar and now go do your push press, you're in a much better position. Your brain's ready to go. And so that wasn't a shoulder stretch and it wasn't a shoulder strength. It was really feeding your brain to, here's what I need you to do right now.
I love that you say that, because my go-to movement in every workout, I think, is the windmill. And I think it's the greatest movement that I wouldn't even say CrossFit introduced me to. I learned this years and years ago from the guys over at Mind Pump. And the windmill, I mean, for me, it's just been a game changer. Like, doing a windmill has everything in it. Your overhead press into, stretching out your hamstrings, core stability. And that for me has been a go-to every single workout. Do you have your athletes do the windmill? Like, do you teach that regularly? Do a lot of high school coaches teach it at all, or college coaches?
It's not something that's prevalent. What I like to actually do is along those same lines, that the elegance of the Turkish getup.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
And how that can be broken down into so many different elements, where I can break down just getting up onto the elbow. And then I can break down the tripod going from on the hand up into half kneeling and getting them to learn from the center to move from the center out. And then being able to do that with the arm overhead and moving your body in all these shapes. It checks so many boxes in terms of stability, mobility, in terms of learning postural control, learning how to own vertical grip. All of that stuff gets incorporated in there. So that in pieces, and breaking that into pieces is usually my go-to that I'll go to there.
Yeah, it's just usually a little difficult to learn. I know I got frustrated with it, and I was like, all right, screw this. You got
to break it into pieces.
That's the thing.
And so that's what I do, is I break it into, I have about 4 different pieces that I break it into. And then what I also do is immediately everybody goes to grab the heaviest kettlebell they can find. And I have a system. You have to earn a kettlebell with me. So what I actually have you do to learn that vertical position of the arm, because essentially that's what you have, is you have one arm locked out facing towards the sky and staying vertical, and everything moves underneath it in this kind of dance type flow, choreographed flow, to make sure you keep that vertical and you own that shoulder position and how you organize yourself underneath it. But what I have you do is take your shoe off and balance the bottom of your shoe on your knuckles. And if you dump the shoe, start back at the bottom. And so you have to do 10 perfect half get-ups just to your forearm before I let you go any further. And then once you go there, I give you another piece of it, and you got to do those. And you have to perfect each piece of it with the shoe before I even give you a kettlebell.
I love that you say that, because I cringe when I see trainers or coaches have their athletes walking with a barbell overhead and rubber bands on either side, holding like the heaviest kettlebell. And you're just like, dude, you don't even know what you're doing, And it's like, you could do so much with a waiter walk or just, the kettlebell upside down, a walk like that, or just standing like you're saying. And what do you say to the coaches that actually do that? And, they're trying to teach their athletes or coaches, trainers, trying to sell something that really isn't as effective as something as simple as just, an upside down overhead kettlebell press.
That's the beauty of YouTube is what you're saying right there. They're what I call YouTube trainers. They basically find cool exercises and they just try to replicate them without really knowing the why. The two things I always say, and when I have my staff, when I have my own facility, I always had one policy that stood over all the rest in terms of training, is that if at any point your client stops and asks you, why am I doing this? And you can't give them a clear and concise answer that applies specifically to their goal, they should stop what they're doing, go to the counter, get their money back, and then you should follow them out, right? Because you're just showing exercises. And showing exercises, like I just said, I can go on YouTube and get tons of exercise for free.
Yeah.
You're not really coaching me. All you're doing is just showing exercises. And I can do that at home for nothing. Coaching is knowing how to get you right at what we call the edge of your ability, meaning where you're successful, where you can actually accomplish it, but you're challenged, whether it's the right load in terms of, I want you to do 5 reps. And when you rack that 5th rep, there wasn't going to be a perfect 6, 7, and 8. 5 was just where you needed to be. Or it's a matter of challenge in terms of stability. Like, I don't need to have you on a single leg balancing on a Bosu ball while you're spinning a stability ball on your nose and you got a bottoms up kettlebell and you're waving a body blade in the other hand. That's just a circus act. That's not coaching and training. That's fitness entertainment. And for some people, that's kind of what they want because it's the only way they'll do fitness. But you also have to be smart enough to say, is this worth the risk? But if I can't give you a real good reason why you're doing something, then get your money back. You're not getting anything from this.
That makes total sense. And before we move on to power, I got a couple more things on speed. What are some of the best external tools that you use or have used? For instance, I mean, personally, I'm a huge fan of the sled. I absolutely hate the parachute more than anything in the world just because I think it's overused and abused. And I think an empty sled could do more for athletes than running with a parachute on their back or, sandbags. Or I also like the bungee cord. I don't know if you've seen those. You harness someone to a bungee cord, they run, and then it teaches them how to come back. Kind of what you're saying about the whole reverse sprinting. I mean, you get a kid on a bungee cord, they're learning both directions. But what are some of the external tools that you like to use with your athletes?
Number one, we already went through is a jump rope.
Yeah.
I think sled drills are awesome because for a lot of reasons. Number one is that because there is no eccentric component, you can do a lot of it and never get sore. So you're not going to really waste your athletes with that. There's been some really good research showing using sled sprints over a period of time will make a huge impact in speed. The sweet spot for the weight on there is somewhere, depending on the strength and size of the athlete, is somewhere between 60 and 85%. Your more conditioned athletes can on the higher end of that in terms of their sprint. And then also keeping those relatively short, just understanding just physiology and that anything beyond that first 10 seconds is not going to have as much carryover in terms of that initial burst, what you're looking for. And then again, it becomes task specific. So the sled is one awesome tool. And then a lot of times it's first, if you can't control your, I'll go back to it again. If you can't control your own body, adding external it's just going to get you good at crappy movement. It's just going to nail that down and hit save on that lousy program. So I want to make sure you have good fluidity first. I mean, talk about tools and a hill. It's not technically a tool, but everybody's got one somewhere. Unless you're in the middle of like the Great Plains.
Hold on a second. If you're in Kuwait, you ain't got no hills. I mean, out in the Middle East, unless you're in like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, I mean, Kuwait's pretty much as flat as can be. I personally used to use a bridge. Like we have these overpass bridges for pedestrians. That's what I used to use for hill sprints. But that is just like hill sprints are number one in my book, to be honest with you. I totally forgot about them.
You don't need that much of a hill, really. You only need a moderate incline. If you look at some of the work, like Derek Hansen does some great stuff with sprinting, and you don't need much as a 10 or 20% grade. Everybody wants to find this iconic iron hill that they're going to run vertical on. It looks cool on your Instagram, but it's not necessarily going to have as much carryover in terms of your acceleration and getting your knees up and getting you to get better turnover. And then also using that downhill with that slight grade it's almost like having you tethered on the front end to a parachute where you have to keep up. Where if you've ever seen that, where you have someone who's running and they're pulling you, well, it's the same, just run downhill. It forces you to learn and get comfortable of going faster and kind of reorganize yourself over that. And that's what a lot of athletic movement is. If you look at the work of like Franz Bosch and talking about self-organization, and really it's not so much about just the force production, but how do you organize yourself to allow yourself to produce that force? So if I'm doing a heavy single arm press overhead, it's not so much how much I can produce from the shoulder out into the implement. It's how well can I organize myself underneath that, and can I set my rib cage and my thorax and my hips and my feet to create a foundation that I can produce that force out of. So one of my mentors early on was Charles Poliquin, and his famous expression was, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe. And so if you don't, again, have that control, then you're not going to be able to even use the force production anyway.
That's funny you say that, because when I did my exo stuff, their number one thing was like, you can't fire a cannon out of a canoe. And it's so true. You really can't. And the neuromuscular response to the added hill sprint downwards is huge. And I think sports science did experiments on this, where when you're using light resistance for speed, sometimes that neuromuscular response, it just makes you do something a lot faster with quicker reflexes. Have you seen that in your field or through your experience? I mean, personally, I've seen it with myself, and that was with baseball mainly. But what about you from your experience over the years?
Well, baseball and golf are way ahead of it in terms of overspeed training. That's what weighted balls are kind of based on, and going back how that all came about. And then now even using weighted, I'll use like Super Speed has these great weighted bats that I'll even use with my throwers just to get them to rotate faster, and then getting that feedback on a radar of seeing how fast you're moving.
Sorry, I just want to clear it up. No, I meant with a lighter bat, for instance.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, all right. I thought you were going with the heavy.
No. And so, on both ends of that. So if you're using weighted balls, everybody just assumes you're getting this, heavy shot put of a baseball that you're throwing.
Yeah.
Where a normal baseball is 5 ounces, you work down to a 3 ounce ball to teach your arm to move faster. And even, as a baseball guy, what did you always, have on deck? Everybody's going back to Lou Gehrig. He swung 2 bats and had to put a donut on the
bat weight. Yeah.
It's actually the worst thing you could do.
That was me until I saw the research on it. And I was like, no way. I've been doing it wrong my entire life. And sure shit, you don't want to swing that weighted bat. Yes, the bat feels lighter, but that neuro response is a lot slower.
Yeah. Remember that muscles are stupid and they just respond to the nervous system.
So are people. Just had to throw that one out there.
They're just
I'll throw myself in that category for that one.
It's all connected. So that's why, I volunteer and coach young kids in baseball. And I don't, they bring a donut to the game. I tell them, put it back in your bag. And then what I actually have is a Swift stick, which is just a bat it's just a light aluminum stick. And you have to swing that thing. And I always tell them, and again, the external cue is, I want to hear a whoosh. You have to create that whooshing sound with it to get that feedback that I need you to move as fast as you can with that bat. Because the faster the bat moves, the harder you're going to hit the ball. And that kind of goes with anything. So that overspeed training is extremely important, whether you're running downhill and sprinting, or whether you're swinging a lighter implement or throwing a lighter ball, or having the feedback of even having like velocity-based training, where it's not so much how much can you bench, but I'm going to put this push unit on the bar and you're going to see how fast that bar moves, and you have to meet or beat that score every single time. So we work on intent, and there's a huge component of that. Throwing a medicine ball against the wall, and I need to hear the loudest sound possible. I need that thing to bounce off the wall as hard as possible. Working on intent is going to have much better carryover for power and speed than just putting another plate on the bar.
No, and it makes sense. And I love you bring back, you talk about the bench press, because I think a lot of people, a lot of athletes do the bench press with as much weight as possible. And they have that really slow coming down, that really slow going up. And my uncle, who's an old school bodybuilding coach, when I was a baseball player, he saw me bench pressing. He was like, why are you throwing so much on there? I was like, oh, I want to lift a lot of weight. And he was like, that's just making you a lot slower, right? Like, huh? And I never got it. And then he had me actually stop going all the way down, going to about 2 inches, an inch and a half above my chest, saying that's all you need to do. And if you want, teach it to come up fast. You want to be as fast and as quick out of the hole as possible, because that's what's going to translate to sports and create those fast twitch muscle fibers. And back then I was like, what the hell's he talking about? All right, let me try it. And sure as shit, it did actually make a big difference in my game, especially when it came to power output. And that was the next thing I wanted to talk about. After lockdown, how did you get your athletes back into that range of producing the power, probably get back to the power that they were getting to before lockdown, but post lockdown to get those gains, so to speak, and I'll go using the bro term here, to get those gains on their power output afterwards. What were some of the methods that you used and how did you look at it? Because it's unlike any other situation.
Yeah, the only way you can improve your power is either you got to increase the force you have to overcome, or you have to move faster. And so we didn't have the ability to have resistance. I had kids in their living room working out. So doing something as simple as split jumps in their intent of getting as much height as they can and different variations of that. I think one of the forgotten arts of coaching is tempo. Is that we always say you're going to do this exercise for this many reps and this many sets. But I could take the bench press. We could do a 5-show series on just variations of the bench press that all work on different tempos. And the difference between taking a bar and coming down on a 4 count, pausing on your chest and exploding up versus a 3 count down and a 3 count up, they're completely different profiles that you're going to get. And most people don't even think about that. They're just moving the weight from A to B. Can I survive getting this from A to B? And then if I did, I'll put more weight on. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. And then you start talking about how you can start using things to create accommodating resistance, where you're going to attach bands to the bar or chains to the bar. And not only attaching the bands pulling down, but you can attach the band pulling up, where you can work on more speed. I'm going to work on how quickly can I turn this around from lockout to down to back to lockout, and working on this, all the different layers of that force velocity continuum. That's where you're going to ultimately build the most power.
And that's my biggest knock on powerlifters, to be honest with you, is they don't use, some of the tools that sports have been using for the past 10, 15 years. I say that because my wife's a powerlifter and she won't listen to this anyways. I hope she doesn't, because she'll kill me for saying this. But, when I see her training, or when I see, actually her training's not bad, but when I see the other powerlifters out there and they're only using one thing, or they'll throw the chains on to look cool. But what about all the other shit that you're not doing out there that you could be doing? And one of them is the descent. I mean, right now in my program, I've got a 4-second descent, and then I've got a 3-second pause, and, up as fast as I can. And that's on a front squat. Now I know my clean is going to go up next month because my front squat's going to go up. That's my problem right now, is I'm catching it, but I can't stand up out of it. So my coach is working with me on different variations. And some athletes forget that those variations exist. What do you do to remind your coaches, or the coaches that work with you, of those variations that will show dividends later on?
Well, the first thing is, ironically, a lot of these variations come from the powerlifting world. I mean, the godfather of powerlifting is Louis Simmons and what they do at Westside Barbell. And he's the one that realized that if I do these things where I work with bands and chains and eccentric hooks and these kind of things.
I got to send you some profiles from the powerlifters that I've been watching, man. I just cringe when I see them. I'm like, all I see you do is squat, deadlift, and bench press, and that's it. There's zero accessory work, zero thinking outside of the box. It's all on percentages. It's that new school of thought where it's all on the percentages, and the percentages only matter. So sorry not to cut you off, but I'll send you some links, man.
So, yeah, I mean, you just look up the work of Louis and Westside Barbell and what they've done.
I know Westside Barbell well.
Really was forward thinking at the time for when he was doing it, and its application to athletics, and not only in producing power, but seeing how much it produced improvements in their own strength. And so making them better power lifters. So that's kind of where you go there. Now, there also is the thing that I always tell athletes is that, are you training to get better at training, or are you training to get better, right? A power lifter trains to get better at training, right? They squat, bench, and deadlift to get better at squat, bench, and deadlift. Whereas if I have a baseball player, you're deadlifting to get better at baseball. So there comes a point where you're going to kind of check. And again, everything is just a checklist for me, right? So the first thing I look at is how well do you move? And I use a movement screen to look at that, to say, do you have enough movement that I can now go to the next thing? Do you have enough motor control? Then do a motor control screen. Do you have that? Then I'll do some sort of power testing to see, are you deficient? And if you are, where are you deficient? Create a profile. And that's where I'll use some of the TPI power test or an FCS, a fundamental capacity screen. because there's going to come a point where I'm going to check the box for strength, where like once you've gotten to like a double body weight deadlift, I don't know if the short stop doing more than that is going to get that much more gains out of it than they would from going and training a different element. I sit down and I show a performance pyramid with all my athletes that has 60 different elements to it, ranging from the mental aspects to all the different physiological aspects to recovery. I say that's 60 things. Strength is one box. Once we've checked that box, I'm not going to keep focusing on that until I know all the other 59 are in check, and they're usually not. And so I'm going to focus on wherever is going to be the weakest link to hold you back. And there's just not enough hours in the day to only be focused on one out of 60 elements and attributes that an athlete needs.
No, I think that's so true. And, there's so many one-track minded coaches and athletes out there that only think, okay, strength is all that matters, or conditioning. Lately, I've been seeing a craze with conditioning and coaches conditioning their athletes. And it's like, dude, he's a sprinter. He's going to sprint once. It's diminishing returns when you have him sprint 10 times at full velocity, because he's only going to have one good sprint out of those 10. The rest are going to be like shit and slow as hell. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because you see that a lot. And you even see it with strength training where people just overdo it and they think sometimes more is better, when in reality, sometimes less could be better. Like 3 box jumps could be better than 10.
Yeah, it's all biased on quality. So one of the things that I'll do is one of the workouts, so like I gave to the kids, once they can start going out to a field, right? And I couldn't be with them and I needed something to monitor, and they could go be with a friend at a field, is I'd have them do max effort sprints of either 50 or 100 yards, let's say, for easy math, and have them time that sprint. And I use a 10% rule, and that whatever time it took you to do that, so let's say for easy math, you ran your 100 yards in 10 seconds. You have to do your next sprint in 10.1 or less, right? You can only go up 10%. If you decrease your performance by more than 10%, go home. You're done for the day. Now, what's your conditioning? Your conditioning is that you can have better work tolerance, that the next day you may be able to get to your 3rd sprint before you drop off, or your 4th sprint before you drop off. If not, you're getting good at being slow. So I do it all based on quality. So whether you're doing it with sprints, whether you're doing it with, like I said, some sort of measurement for force velocity, where you're looking at either a radar or you're looking at a push band that says once your quality goes down, you're done. And so that's really what it's gauged on. And you can't, this is one of the big mistakes where conditioning gets lost, because a lot of conditioning is I'm just going to be a hard ass and make you tired and sweat. That's not conditioning. Conditioning, when you talk about a power athlete, is you can't create power and get tired at the same time. If you're really truly training for speed and power, you're going home feeling like I had way more in the tank. You can't get gassed out and ultimately train on the opposite end for power and speed. They're physiologically opposed to each other.
That makes sense. And one of my game changers actually in CrossFit was training at my 80% capacity and getting my 80% better, if that makes any sense. Whereas if I go 100%, I'm trashed for, a week, because I'm old. I'm 37 years old. You know what I mean? I'm not getting any younger, and my body doesn't recover how it used to. So I knocked it down to about 80%. And I was like, oh, this is working. And I would have more in the tank when I was done. And that would feed into the next day. And then I would go and do something off the charts by trying to, break one of my previous times or a PR. And then it just, that whole cycle of I didn't recover well enough starts again and going from there. But I want to stick with power. And one of the things that I see a lot of American and Western coaches doing now is they're utilizing Olympic lifts. And Olympic lifts have been popularized over the last, probably 5 or 6 years more than before. How do you feel about that? I mean, I know it has its place, but in my opinion, personally, I think if you're not an Olympic coach or an Olympic lifting coach and know the ins and outs and the proper form, you shouldn't be having athletes do it, because you're just kind of increasing their risk of injury.
Yeah, you got to know how to coach it. And then you also got to know your setting. If I have a weight room and I could have a weight room with 40 kids in it, I'm not teaching the Olympic lifts. All right. I can get as much done with teaching them some of the elements of the Olympic lifts or doing maybe some dumbbell variations of it. But the time, it's the risk reward and the time investment it's going to take to coach them this, there's too many other things I got to cover with a high school athlete. There's just too much. I can't invest the time in doing that. Now, if I was in maybe a college or a pro setting where I had more time with you, actually a pro setting is not a good example, but a college setting, if I had more time with you, then yeah, maybe I could invest a little more time in teaching that to you because I may have some assistants and other coaches, but you have to kind of know that you have to allocate specific time. Like I explained to everybody, like if you're really good at these 3 exercises, they give you a medal. Like this is a sport. And so for me to just flippantly program that in next to, a bench press, like that's a totally different thing, right? So I have to spend time and be able to actually teach you how to do it right, or it's not going to create the great results. Because a lot of time we assume a result based on the name or based on how it looks. So I'll give you 2 examples. We say power clean. Well, the first question is, does this athlete even need power? Unless you did an assessment like I did, we're making an assumption they need power.
Just to let you know, I saw a college level coach having his golfers, the golfers of the school or whatever, the golf team doing power cleans. And I'm like, why? And it was horrible. It was the worst form I'd ever seen in my life. And we're talking, a D1 school here. And I was shocked. I was really shocked.
I think there is value actually for a golfer to do that, an explosive hip extension. If you look at a slow motion of how explosive their hip extension needs to be, there can be some value. Now, there's no value in doing any exercise with shitty form, right? It doesn't matter what it is.
I agree with you. 100%. Getting that triple extension and getting that hip extension, I agree 100% on that. But there are so many different things that you could teach that golfer will get more bang for his buck or reduce the amount of injury, like teaching a trap bar clean, just reducing that, that catch in the front and just kind of just getting that extension up. That to me is more beneficial than having him go and do a shitty reverse forearm curl.
Yeah, like I said, anything shitty. And then again, you're making the assumption that's generating power. If you do it right, yeah, it can generate a lot of hip power. Done wrong, all you're doing is just beating the crap. I could always tell when a kid that I work with who's worked out with his team and they did power cleans when they got their wrists all taped up and their backs hurt because they just do a jumping curl and catch and slam into their lumbar facets. But making the assumption that the person A needs power without doing a test to even find that out to begin with, without testing their broad jump, their vertical jump to say, does this person even need power? They may actually have more than enough power. That's not their weakest link, right? They have power that they can't control. They have power that they can't get into because they don't have the mobility, or they have power, but they have no strength. So I want to figure out, is it even what they need? Then to make the assumption that the power clean is going to create power. Well, not if you load the bar too heavy, not if you do it in proper form. And so we make these assumptions based on the outside looking in that this exercise does this. So another example is when you look at conditioning and you're going to assume that, oh, this is going to be perfect for my HIIT workout because it's going to burn a lot of calories, get the heart rate up real high. The beauty of, and kind of going back to what you're saying before, looking at recovery, the beauty of some of the things that are out now with like Whoop bands and the Morpheus strap and Aura rings is you can not only gauge the recovery, but you can get real-time feedback of what these exercises are doing to you.
Do you monitor your athletes just out of curiosity? I know a lot of coaches now actually they can monitor their athletes through their apps and, see if their athletes are having, shitty recovery, basically checking out if they're partying. And I had a coach on here that was saying, yeah, like I can see all the data from my athletes and I know if, so-and-so only slept 5 hours, he was out partying the night before. And, I can call him out on it for doing something stupid before a hard practice. Do you monitor your athletes just out of curiosity?
Yes and no. I do it for a very different reason. It's not for me to be the hall monitor. I'm doing it to create awareness. I want them to monitor themselves. I want them to have that aha moment. So that's number one. So when they show up and they're like, yeah, I'm not getting it done today. Like I don't have the juice in the tank. And then when they look at their recoveries at 40%, because maybe they went out and, and they had some drinks the night before or any of those things, I want them to have that awareness. Wow, I never put all of it together. They're all 24 hours together. I didn't realize this was a separate bucket for me. There was training and then there's what I did the rest of the day. And now they're seeing this holistic image of how all these systems interrelate. And then also kind of going back to what I was saying before is being able to see. So like a great example is Pavel Tsatsouline has a great down and dirty series of workouts he does, whether it's simple and sinister or quick and the dead that he has where you combine like a kettlebell swing and a Turkish get-up is simple and sinister, and you do a specific profile. And so most people think if you look at those two from the outside in, from a conditioning effect, which one's going to get my heart rate up? The swing or the get-up?
It depends on how much intensity you have. I mean, You can make a Turkish get-up real hard.
Okay, so here's the thing, is that most people from the outside looking in see the dynamics of the bell swinging and the ballistic movement of the swing, and they're assuming, well, that's the one's going to pump up your heart rate, and the get-up is this slow-moving, type choreographed maneuver. my heart rate shoots to the roof on the get up, and I actually recover during the swing. Now, some of that is based on each person's profile. So if you have someone that's more explosive, they're not going to get as taxed by the swing. Where someone who's the opposite profile, who's super sturdy and steady, but doesn't have a lot of force production, that's going to be the opposite. But we make this assumption blanketed for everybody that this exercise is going to get your heart rate up and this exercise is going to get you powerful. And it's really somewhat specific to the individual. And that's the art of coaching, is to know that this is the perfect exercise for this guy, but the next platform over, that's going to be the worst thing for them to do, because that's going to pull the emergency brake up on their power.
It's funny that you distinguish between the Turkish get up and the kettlebell swing, because I learned a trick to the kettlebell swing, and I learned it from rowing. Actually, it's the recovery portion, which is the descent for me is my recovery. And I could do kettlebell swings all day now just because I've learned that motor pattern. I've learned how to breathe, and it makes a world of a difference compared to when I used to do it with shitty form and everything's breaking down and my back's hurting, the next day. So, I mean, can you talk about that? And I think that's something that people don't talk about a lot. Do you teach your kids or your athletes to recover in between plays, for instance? You'll have a hard sprint for a soccer forward, you'll have a hard sprint forward. And then do you teach them sort of, all right, this is your recovery times that jog backwards, or, that 80% back is your recovery time. Just like with the row, going back into the rower, that's your recovery time. How do you handle that with your athletes?
95% of that is how I coach their breathing and getting them to learn how to breathe properly. And one of the things that I'll do is, one of the conditioning days I'll do with all my teams is that they have to, and I teach them about nasal breathing and how important that is. That, if you look at your opponent and they're breathing through the mouth, they're cooked, they're done, right? That's a stress type breathing. Teaching them how to breathe through their nose, teaching them to try to expand their breath fully down into their belly, and then controlling their exhales, and is one of the biggest things I do with conditioning. And so it could be something as simple as where I'll do either just a brisk walk and a sprint, or with like a soccer athlete, and since you brought it up, I'll do because a lot of their conditioning is walk, jog, run, is that they have to walk, jog, run. Maybe they walk for 20 seconds or 30 seconds, they jog for 10 seconds, and then they sprint all out for 5, but they have to only breathe through their nose. And what you'll start to see is who are the people who nasal breathe throughout the day, because they're not as affected by it, where there's some people who are going to look like they're drowning. They're just heaving, trying everything, and they're so uncomfortable and everything's burning because it's the first time they've had the force to breathe through their nose. And once they can learn to settle their psyche and learn how to control that breath, it makes all the difference in the world. I mean, cardiovascular conditioning, cardiorespiratory conditioning is fundamentally about oxygen delivery. And if you're not breathing properly, it doesn't matter what mental technique or body position I put you in if your breathing is off. Breathing is the key to all of it.
That makes a lot of sense, and I totally agree with that. And I mean, for baseball players, it's really kind of just, sprint maybe, and then you get to stand around for a while. So breathing to me was really important when I was hitting. If I didn't catch the right breath when I swung the bat, I just didn't have that rhythm. It was always a rhythm check for me. And it was on the exhale is when I would probably I'd breathe in, exhale, swing the bat. And usually that's when I'd hit the ball the hardest, or I'd come out and I'd be like, wow, I actually hit that ball. I hit the shit out of that ball, so to speak. But real quick, before we wrap up, what are some of your top 3 exercises or your workouts for speed development? And besides the jump rope, because I know that's, the jump rope's your go-to, but I'd say speed, power, and velocity. Or velocity and power could be the same, so to speak. I mean,
it's going to be somewhat specific based on the individual, the athlete, and what their kind of parameters are and what they're looking to do. That, I give a different 3 answers for my catcher than I will for
100%
a defensive back.
What about for the general coach? Something that you've seen a lot of coaches not doing, a lot of the general coaches not doing. Something they could incorporate in with their athletes, whether it be football, basketball, baseball, or soccer.
Okay, so power using medicine balls, I think, is extremely important. Eric Cressy has some great stuff. He just actually has a new course out with medicine ball stuff. There's using medicine ball throws is, I think, a great way to generate power, and is a great intent feedback of how far you throw the ball or how hard it hits the wall of the floor. In terms of creating speed and getting that connection through the hips, sprinting is number 1. And then if I have to be stationary and I'm locked in the house, then I'm probably going to really learn the art of a good kettlebell swing. Not some, seizure-like thing that most people are doing of just throwing a weight from A to B, but really learning like how someone like Pavel or Brett Jones at Strong First would teach you how to properly set your hips and explode your hips and snap your knees and rip that weight down and throw it back out. A kettlebell swing has so much carryover to so many things. That would be, kind of one of my desert island things if I had the ability to do that, but I can't get out and sprint. And then from there, I think body control and learning how to decelerate, like working breakdowns, single leg, working at split stance, being able to put the brakes on and own that movement and getting that appreciation and awareness, I think is the other missing factor to kind of put all the pieces together.
That's awesome, man. I'd love to bring you back on for unilateral training. I have a feeling that would be a hell of an episode. It just seems like that's something that would be right in your wheelhouse, man.
That's where it all starts. That's where all my programs start, right there.
I know, right?
Tell you where we go with that.
I know. That's something I learned years ago. That's what teaches you the balance. That's what teaches you a lot of the control. And till this day, I suck at, a single-legged RDL. It's just... And one coach said, maybe it's just a neurological thing that you just can't master. And, I've tried different variations. I've gotten a lot better, but by no means am I a pro at it, So, but here's another thing, just before we wrap up, I know I already said this. What about recovery and the amount of volume and load that you put on your athletes in the gym versus what they're actually doing for sport-specific training?
Okay, so I think we look at it backwards, is that what's become big and recovery's become sexy and everybody's got massage guns and cryo tanks and leg sleeves and all these things for recovery, is those all have some value. But if you're constantly breaking yourself down and you're training to that point, that's a problem. Like if you're doing it in competition, that's what we train for. But if you're doing that and you're training, maybe we got to look on the front end. And there's a great book out by Dan Heath called Upstream. And the concept is looking upstream instead of downstream. Downstream is fixing it after it breaks. Upstream is let's fix this thing before it breaks. And really, how do I monitor your stress and really what we want to be? And I think the strength coach of the future is not some just dispensary of exercises and reps and sets, but really a pharmacist of hormetic stress. That's good stress, what's called eustress. And how do I carefully plot just enough where you're in that challenge but successful, you're in that edge of your ability, and where I can get you as smoked as I can, but you're still going to be able to come back tomorrow from it and be able to bounce back from it. That's the art of really being a great coach. Anybody can torch somebody. That takes nothing whatsoever. Give me a whiteboard and a marker, and I'll walk out of here. I'll be limping out of here. But that doesn't take any art. The art is how far can I push you and still have you be able to come back and perform tomorrow.
I think we're going to end it on that note. That was, I like that. The future strength coach. That's a good one, man. I personally have to give credit to my own coach. He's pretty good with managing me and my stress and volume levels and everything, and telling me when to reel it in. At my age, at 37, it's like recovery and knowing when to push the gas it's a big deal when you get a little bit older.
You keep saying older. I wake up wishing I was 37 again.
How old are you, man? You look pretty young, dude. So
yeah, I was 37 11 years ago. So I wake up wishing I was 37. So That's the art that you'll find is how do I play the long game here? And that it's not about one rep, one set, one workout, 1 week. It's about how do I continually get better and not break down in the process.
100%. Yeah. And I know eventually in a couple of years, CrossFit is going to be the end game for me. And I'm just going to probably do like triathlons and crap to stay with it, once I destroy my knees or something.
Well, they can destroy you just as well. You do anything enough, it'll destroy you enough. You do anything right and you can live through it.
That does make sense, man. But thank you so much for coming back on the show. Really appreciate it. It was great having you back on. Love to have you back on again, man. It's always a good chat. Sure, I always pick something up. I'm sure our listeners always pick something up too.
Well, it's always a good time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. You can also find us on Instagram at The Project Kuwait. Thank you, and join us next time.